all of the extant works that we have by him. But so, yeah, the Athenian constitution, they never used it, by the way. He wasn't really that popular in Athens because of his attachment to Alexander, and Alexander was not a Greek. He was a Macedonian. I know, that's confusing. I know, I grew up thinking Alexander was, a Greek, but actually, no, they were Macedonians, and Macedonians still today don't think of themselves as Greeks, nor do the Greeks really appreciate the Macedonians. Political divide, and if you were aware, they just recently resolved a dispute over the name of Macedonia so that Macedonia could legitimately apply to become a member of the EU. So, there's still issues there, and yet.
So
So it was politically incorrect.
Would we have to get a new name for the Hellenistic period?
That's an issue. Yeah. We could revise history, of course. That's what history's for. Let's revise it. But the categories we'll definitely talk about this evening. You might also update that and call them sets. You might think of it as set theory, in a sense. So we'll have fun with that. On dreams is on the gate with animals. They walk. You get it? I mean, what Aristotle writes about is very specific and very detailed and boring, depending on your interest, right? On generation and corruption, that's birth and death, growth, deteriorating, right? On the heavens, so that's astronomy, basically, right? How the heavens work. Keep in mind that for Aristotle, the Earth was the center. So it's a geocentric theory, but he did know that the Earth was round. I don't know where the flat Earth thing comes in. Scientists never thought it was a flat Earth. Columbus did not think it was a flat Earth. He knew it was round. The argument was, how round was it? How far? Right? Is that confusing to you? The argument was with other mathematicians over how big the Earth was, and Columbus was wrong. He thought it would be much shorter. He'd be able to get there with, all the way to Asia, basically. And as we know, had it not been for his discovery of an in-between continent, he really would have perished. He would not have made it because their ships were not designed to cross the Pacific. Right? So clearly, Columbus was a great navigator, but a very bad mathematician compared to some other great mathematicians of his day. Because they were arguing how far it would be to the Spice Islands and so on. They were already going around the Horn of Africa and the Cape Hope, or Cape, the Cape, the one down the bottom. They were already doing that. Yeah, they were already doing that, and it was a long, miserable trip. I mean, that's actually why they were establishing posts along the way, because they really couldn't sail all that distance in one swell swoop. They had to have breaks where they could refresh their water supplies and so on. And the one port that they set up was in the Namibian desert, which is, if you ever had a chance to look at that, it's like the driest place on earth, I believe, and has been for like the longest period of time. So my sister-in-law got to visit it, which was kind of neat, finding that out and talking about it with her. She was a student for a year in South Africa, which is are they called when you're in the college and you do a year outside of the college? There's a name for it. You know. Exchange student. So she lived with a family in South Africa for the year. So, my son visited Kenya with Engineers Without Borders, which was neat. He was only there for like 2 weeks, and they built a medical thing in a village. So it's kind of neat. He sent back pictures. Visited Paris on the way. The only picture he sent us back was a picture of skulls in the catacomb. Oh, back to it. So, on the heavens. Just Ptolemy was after Aristotle. So the Ptolemaic or Ptolemy's system, which is the earth-centered one that they had as the correct center up until Galileo, came slightly after Aristotle. It was certainly influenced by Aristotle. The history of animals on interpretation is kind of important. On longevity and shortness of life, how to live a long time. By the way, Aristotle tells in his writings that if you are a pregnant woman, you should not drink much wine because it has a bad effect on the children. This is 2,300 years ago. It's not my fault. By the way, my mom was told by her doctor that a little wine would help the baby relax. So guess what? I'm sure I had a little wine, you know, in my fetal, up, you know.
A little bit of that hurt.
Glass of wine, Marlboro Red. Take the edge off.
Yeah, it helps, you know, when the baby's not, you know, it's wrestling around at night and you can't get any sleep. Drink a little wine. Yeah, knock the kid out. What? Okay, so on memory and reminiscences, I don't remember reading that one. That could have been funny. So metaphysics is the one, well, I posted as I know, it's absolutely terrible compared to even Plato. But keep in mind that we're supposedly not able to see any of Aristotle's actual written works. These are notes that his students took. Well, that simply can't be right. These are obviously written to, and some of it clearly must have been writing by Aristotle, not just his students or you know, the people listening to him. But even so, they're considered like the kind of notes you would use while you're teaching about a topic. And he was supposed to have written some really beautiful literature, and that's been lost. And maybe someday will be found again. But so part of the reason it's difficult to read Aristotle compared to, say, thinking of Plato's dialogues as literature is that these are much more kind of like technical scientific information instead of you know, dialogues that are clearly meant to be played in front of an audience, you know, so to teach a certain point through drama, right? If you think of it. So metaphysics, meteorology, weather, right? You would say. On the motion of animals, the Nicomachean Ethics, very, very significant book. People still read it and apply it to today. In fact, just last night till about 3:30 in the morning, because I have no life.
I noticed that. Your reply last night. It's about as late as mine.
Well, I had a long nap, you know, so I'm okay. But so I was up late watching Alistair McIntyre give a lecture. It was really last July, but it was. He's an Aristotelian, and an ethicist, and he's Irish, but they call him an American philosopher because most of his career he's been teaching in America. But he's clearly Irish. When you listen to him, you can tell. The accent is very clear. In any case, so that comes up still today in ethics. In fact, he argues that, as I'll talk about it in the second half tonight, that as Americans, really, Aristotle's ethics is the most, obviously correct one for us to use, compared to, say, deontology, which we think that's ridiculous, basically because of the question that Socrates asks Euthyphro, how do you know God said that? Right? No one knows, right? And so if he says God said this, no drinking alcohol, and this one says, hey, God made, his first miracle, was really good stuff, Wait a minute, what's going on here? Which is God for? For wine, against wine, And by the way, he didn't have coffee, so if he was against coffee, that's kind of really weird how that would have come out. Sorry, that's just fun things. So as Americans, we don't really take deontology seriously. Not really. Utility is a basic, that's the British version of pragmatism. We're pragmatists. But even so, we need something individual. And so virtue ethics, which is Aristotle, basically is us really ethically. So we'll talk about that. Physics is actually nature. For physis, that's the word for nature in Hebrew. Poetics, politics, posterior analytics is part of his logic. Prior analytics is another part of his logic. Prophesizing by dreams, the rhetoric, how to give speeches that are persuasive, basically. Right? Of sense and the sensible, on sleep and sleeplessness, the sophistical refutations. Now, that's pretty interesting because Aristotle is basically either the one who invented logic, or he's at least the one that compiled it based on his resources, and we don't really know which, right? But as a result of his compiling or inventing logic, he then turns it around on his predecessors and points out just how dumb they were, right? And part of that we might have felt as we were going through Plato's ideas. He, of course, spent 20 years with Plato and loves his teachers, his mentors, and yet at the same time still feels they were wrong in their philosophy, their basic understanding of how knowledge worked and so on. On the soul, very important. Plato obviously describes the soul in a way that's more traditional since Plato in our Christian, European, Western heritage, similar perhaps also to the Buddhist. I mentioned there's a possible connection there. And the idea, of course, for Plato is that the soul is invisible, immaterial, not part of the body, etc., right? And so eternal. You can't destroy something that doesn't basically have any substance, right? Aristotle is going to point out in several places, including the Metaphysics, that for something to exist, it has to have substance, and so the ideas, which are non-material, abstract, and for Plato more real than this stuff, because they're unchanging and eternal, right? For Aristotle, they don't exist. Unless they have substance, they're not there. Abstract, non-physical entities are not there. It's just raw. And so the soul, if it is also that same kind of non-thing, basically can't exist. And yet, we certainly do agree that we have souls. What he accepts as the concept of soul is the activity of the body. So if you think about it, that's ingenious. Because if you're trying to figure out, well, what is the soul if it's not eternal, etc., right? It's the activity of the body. So it's not the body, but it's, in a sense, the spiritual, the motion, right? The thing that literally gets the body moving and so on, that makes it, as in Latin we say anima, right? From animated, it's moving, right? Anima is soul in Latin. In Greek, soul is psyche, which is where we get psychology, right? So literally, psychology is the study of the soul. But psyche, which also means breath, which is kind of neat, because if you think of Adam in the creation story in Genesis, Adam means breath, and trying to figure out exactly what God's doing here. He takes like kindling and breathes into the kindling like you do trying to get a fire started, so that idea that Adam is this breath, is kind of like starting a fire. Pretty interesting. Topics: virtues and vices, on youth and old age, on life and death, on breathing. Kind of important, breathing. So obviously lots of choices for you to read. I think that's like his complete works, as far as I know, available on just this site, and obviously there's lots of other sites. You don't notice that these are very specific translations. This is W.D. Ross. These are older translations. If you look and find newer translations that might be a little bit easier to read and follow, you're also probably going to have to pay for them, because the translator is, if it's within the last 50 years, the Mickey Mouse, amount of time. It's now 75 years, by the way. Disney keeps pushing it back because they don't want anyone else to get a hold of the mouse, make it public domain. Right? But in any case, if it's a relatively recent translation, the translator's still trying to get money for it. So that's why if you go to the store and buy a new translation of it, you got to pay for it. When you could go, right, that makes sense. You can buy the old stuff that no one's getting paid for anymore, and that's free out there. Let me also show the Wikipedia page that I mentioned. So if you're looking for more depth on it, you could certainly pick things like the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Let's see all the different areas that they go. But what's interesting is the Wikipedia almost always gives you a picture along with. I happen to have a bust of Aristotle myself at home. It's kind of neat. It was bookends. There was Homer on one side and Aristotle on the other. Barnes and Ignobles sold them, and hey, that's cool. And that was back when I had an actual office where, I could entertain students with kind of. You really want to have that kind of university professor books and stuff. So there's Aristotle. So 384, 322. Remember, there's about a 20-year overlap with Plato, and remember, Plato had in his earlier life about a 20-year overlap with Socrates. And there's no overlap at all between Socrates and Aristotle. But if you're trying to remember the three biggies in classical Greek philosophy, it's SPA: Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Be easy, mnemonic. And I think I mentioned last week, but I can't remember for sure, but both of his parents were medical people of the day, and they had as one of their clients either Philip or the one book, this one, it was one of Philip's ancestors, was a medical client of Aristotle's parents. So the point of it, though, is that there's a connection between Aristotle's family and the rulers of Macedonia. And of course, that's going to include Alexander. And after Aristotle was a student of Plato's for 20 years in the academy in Athens, which was the school that Plato set up. And it's called the academy, and we still have academies, of course. And the reason for it was the park where Plato's school was housed was donated by a man named Academus. And so the park's name was Academus, or Academy, in his honor, because he donated it. By the way, that's another one of those archaeological sites in Athens that you can still go and see. Yesterday, I was using my goggles, my Google Earth virtual reality, to visit the Lyceum, which will be the school that Aristotle sets up later, which is right there in the heart of Athens. It's ruins right now, nothing special to see except a lot of rocks lined up, that kind of thing. But he spent 20 years in the academy. At that point, Plato died, and Xenophanes, was it Xenophanes? No, not Xenocrates. One of Plato's nephews ended up becoming the head of the academy, not Aristotle, and he was disappointed in that. And so he ended up leaving with a friend, and they went to the Isle of Lesbos for a while. And it was at that point that he also then was invited to come and become the tutor for Alexander, who would of course become Alexander the Great in our tradition, right? Alexandros means the savior of men. Andros, Andropos, right, is man, and Alex is the savior. His father, Philip, means the lover of horses. He's a cavalryman, and so on. Right? His mother, Alexander's mother, by the way, famously was not supposed to be, it's the polite term, inseminated by Philip. Which is odd, because Philip is clearly his father, so clearly there's some mythology involved here. But instead, Apollo, the god Apollo, as a snake, was supposed to have inseminated his mother, and therefore Alexander was supposed to be the son of a god. That's obviously just make-believe, right? Okay. But Alexander studied with Aristotle for 6 years, from when he was 12 to when he was 18, and it was clearly going to go longer than that when Philip was assassinated and Alexander took over the army and marched off with them, and so Aristotle headed back to Athens, and that's when he created the Lyceum, which was his school. Apparently just down the street from the academy, competing school for the academy. When Alexander reached 33 years old, you're probably familiar with him dying an early death, And as a result, all heck broke loose. His generals split his empire up. Antiochus, Ptolemy, and Antiochus, Ptolemy. Who's the third one? I can't think of the third one. Sorry. But they split it up. And Antiochus was the one that got Greece. But the thing about that is that the Greeks were not happy in any case, and once they got news that Alexander had died, they basically attacked everybody they thought was associated with him, including Aristotle, who fled prior to being attacked, and famously said, "Lest Athens sin twice against philosophy." Great quote. Figure the first sin would be killing Socrates. So Aristotle didn't want them to sin twice and kill himself. So that's kind of interesting. At that point, he was basically away from Athens for a little over a year when he died, probably of natural causes, whatever those would be. I believe he was 68 at the time. Did it say that? So can you figure that out? Is that not right? Maybe you're counting backwards in BC. Seems to me though 68 was about, he was the youngest of the three. I think Socrates was what, 70? Plato was 62? Man, I've beaten him like years ago. Wow, that's interesting. Okay, so just a basic study. Now the thing is, because of his not being liked primarily by Athens, his books literally ended up getting lost. He gave them to people, they hid them. Some of them were like buried someplace and dug up later, many years later. And it took a while before anybody really took interest in them. And mostly what happened was they went south into Arabic hands, where they were translated into Arabic by several significant Arabic philosophers, and eventually then it would work its way back into Europe through the Crusades, actually, through translations and into Europe through the Crusades, where it had an impact, and we'll see why when we look at his critique of Plato. So when we think about the metaphysics, physis is nature. Meta is a word in Greek that means that which follows, or the next level, for example. So for example, when they, many years later, gathered his works, once they had them again in Europe, and they referred to a collection of books as the physics, then they said, what should we call this volume which follows the physics? And they, of course, just decided to say that which follows the physics. And so metaphysica is how metaphysics got its name. That's the collection of things in that volume that were being issued. So it's kind of happenstance, not clearly the right word for it. Although today we can certainly think of it as what are we really looking at when we're talking about metaphysics? We're looking at the ground of what makes nature the way it is. So when we're thinking about things like the arche that we saw with Thales and Anaximander and Anaximenes and Pythagoras and the others, that's part of the metaphysics. And he's the one that gives us that history. So as I was explaining Thales and the others and saying we didn't really have writings from them, basically what we have are some links, or rather isolated lines of text that we would have from them. And we really got those mostly from Aristotle, and it's this work where he gives us that. So this includes kind of a history of all the predecessor philosophers to Aristotle in a history format that basically shows how Aristotle's philosophy is the culmination of all this wonderful Greek analysis of the nature of nature, right? Aristotle's the culmination. You study my philosophy and you've got it. This is knowledge, all of knowledge, right? And by the way, that attitude about his work was something that infected everybody that really got a hold of it, because all through the Middle Ages, once his work had been reintroduced, it became accepted that this was knowledge. We know it. We know all that there is to know. So that kind of held up any further development. If you think about it, the scientific revolution occurred as a revolt against Aristotle's philosophy. Galileo, for example, the big conflict he had, what was scary for him, was that the things that he was discovering as he would do his experiments contradicted principles that Aristotle had in his work, but that was part of what the dogma of the church included, because everybody thought Aristotle's knowledge was the knowledge of everything, right? So he was literally fighting against not just Aristotle's principles, but against the church, of course, right? And so that kind of rebirth, reinterest in the Greek literature was a reinterest in the Greek writings other than Aristotle. Aristotle became the bad guy, basically, among many of the continental Europeans. Oddly, the British, tended to like Aristotle, and what we see in England was really a group of Aristotelians. Thomas Hobbes, for example, Francis Bacon. The logic of Aristotle is called the organum, which means the tool, right? This is the tool you use to think. And Francis Bacon, one of his books, writes the novum organum. So he's clearly an Aristotelian that's trying to introduce some progress. And basically, that's where he introduces the idea of inductive reasoning instead of deductive reasoning. Aristotle's primarily deductive reasoning in nature. Deduction, by the way, means from these principles or these axioms, I can conclude this. Right? Induction, on the other hand, is, hey, this is the case, and this is the case, and hey, I bet they're all like that. So, for example, the most famous would be, hey, there's a swan, and it's white. There's a swan, and it's white. Ah, there's another swan, and it's white. And you have to have four. And once you have four, it's like, whoa, they all must be white. Right? Thank you, Aristotle. Right? By the way, there are black swans. And in fact, just out of, if you're interested, there's a book called and it's titled that just because that's a famous thing. The white swan thing, all swans are white, as an example of inductive reasoning. If you see four swans, you know all of them are white. There goes a black one. What? And so keep in mind, it's not the ballerina in. There's a movie called The Black Swan, right? I haven't seen it. But no, that's a whole nother thing. But this is, the idea of the black swan is famous because that just goes to show you that inductive reasoning is flawed. It's a guess. Whereas deductive reasoning is absolute, as we will see. So that's a relatively... He became famous, by the way, because he was one of the hedge fund people that gambled and said that, you know, there's going to be a crash. It was, what, 89? No, what year was it that 2008? 2008, the 2008 crash was the one that he said, you know, the real estate's going to crash, etc. And he became at least a millionaire. I don't know if he made billions, but he became very rich because of his hedge fund purchases that predicted certain collapse, you know, in the market. And of course, after that, everybody went and, you know, considered him to be a genius because he knew that was going to happen, etc. He's written some other books since, and they're not very popular. Okay. So, looking at some of very famous first line, all men by nature desire to know. It's not actually true. I've found some people that could care less about a lot of things. It's kind of annoying. It could very well be that Aristotle just spent most of his time with people that really did want to know, and he didn't ride the bus. You know. Ooh, was that bad? It's politically incorrect. There's my elitist Platonic attitude creeping through. Wow. But all men by nature desire to know. But this actually gets to part of Aristotle's interpretation of everything. By nature, animals are born with the faculty of sensation, etc., etc. The animals, other than man, live by appearances and memories and have but little of connected experience, etc. In other words, they're not nearly as thinking animals as man is. So you're going to get the sense that for Aristotle, the significant characteristic of man is that he is a thinking thing, right? So when you think of even our Latin Homo sapiens, right? In fact, we're Homo sapiens sapiens, officially, which means we're man, the knowledge, right? Sapient means having knowledge, right? So we're wise. Other animals are not. And what does that mean? It means they believe Aristotle and his description of what makes human beings so significant is that we think. And not only that, but we use language. And as far as he's concerned, that's not the case with other animals. By the way, we now, of course, know that dolphins have language and names, elephants, giraffes, dogs, but not in the same kind of way that man does. So you could talk to your dog, and the dog seems to understand a lot, but at the same time, it's still pretty clear that people talk in ways that we can. Remember Lara, the lecture that I showed with Lara from the TED Talk from last time. That's still our attitude today. So that's really kind of an Aristotelian attitude that we are relatively unique among animals, and it's primarily because of our interest in knowledge and the way we transmit it. Right? So this is all part of that. Right? And then he gets into this nature of science and Thales, and he goes, as I said, he goes through the history of that, the pre-Socratics, and leads it up to Plato. And once he gets into Plato, he starts explaining Plato's philosophy and the idea. And by the way, he explains it clearer than Plato does, because Plato's really very, it's a dialectic or a dialogue. And as a result, you have to kind of figure out, well, what's the real point here out of all of this, right? Aristotle literally describes the theory of knowledge of Plato, the idea that ideas, which he's invented, basically, we'll never get rid of that, thank goodness, because we do have ideas. We believe in ideas. We just don't think they're abstract entities that structure the universe somehow, right? Platonists that way. We're really much more like Aristotle. We think that the universe really is a physical structure with substance in it. So Plato's theory is a wonderful new development, but it's wrong. So for Aristotle, we have to do a detailed analysis of what knowledge is, what true statements are. And so we get into the logic. And we have terrific sites. So I'll use Stanford again. Why not? So, this is still taught today in logic classes. It used to be mandatory for everybody in college. As colleges started having to compete and attract students, and instead of telling students what to study, decided to offer what students wanted and take away mandatory courses because they don't want students mad at us because then they don't give us their money, right? So it's, at the point where colleges gave up knowing that they knew better than students did what they ought to study, this became more of a voluntary course for students to take. And by the way, it seems to me in the national discourse, that's pretty obvious that it's been roughly 50 years that our colleges have not been forcing people to actually study logic, because the kind of discourse that we've got going on is not very logical, frankly. But you'll be all set now because we're going to cover this, so you'll be all set. Right? Though you really should take a logic course because you get a lot more, of course, out of the whole course than just 10, 15 minutes of basic logic. So what Aristotle does is study the nature of language. So you get grammar, so you get nouns, you get verbs, you get adjectives, you get adverbs, you get commas, sentence structure, and different kinds of sentences. So for example, yippee! That's an utterance, but guess what? It's neither true nor false. You notice? How old are you? That's a question. That's neither true nor false as well. Go shut the door, and then come follow me. Past help, past hope. Sorry, that's my Juliet. But, Romeo and Juliet, she was the, yeah, okay. That's an imperative. That's neither true nor false. The past help, past hope thing, that might be. But shut the door. That's an imperative. That's neither true nor false. So what is true or false? True or false has to be a declarative sentence. That's what we say, right? And what form can a declarative sentence take, right? It takes either the universal affirmative, all S is P, or every S is P. S is your subject, P is your predicate. Universal negative, no S is P. subject, predicate, right? So, for example, all horses are animals would be a universal affirmative. If there's a thing that's a horse, it's also in the set of things, the category of things that are animals, right? Right? And by the way, that's true or false? All horses are animals. True, yes. By definition, right? Exactly, right? No dogs or cats. True or false?
Dogs are pets?
No dogs are cats.
Depends on who you ask.
If they say that there are some, they are wrong, because that is false. That is true. No, now I'm confused. What did you do to me?
Some people say that dogs that are 50 pounds are cats. Are useless.
And the reason Patrick just laughed was because that's wrong. Which, by the way, that explains a lot of humor. Humor is fallacious reasoning that was not actually an attempt to fool you, right? It's just make you laugh. It's not my fault. That's just true, right? Okay. So, universal negative. I mean, that's funny because we know that they're wrong. You know, unless they're changing the meaning of dogs and cats, you know. I have chihuahuas, and they're not cats. Well, they'd be wrong. They're foxes, actually.
Well, there you go.
There you go. Well, the wolves, foxes, chihuahuas. You know, so they were actually wolves, but wolves. They say dogs, you know. You have a dog, it's really a wolf in disguise. And if it's a pug with a bow on it, that's really, they sacrifice a lot by giving up their wolf status. Okay. The third type of statement that you can make that's true or false. Some S is P. So, for example, that horse, I'm pointing to a horse, is a gelding, that particular one. You know, you could go check. You say, yes, it is. Or, no, it isn't. Right? You could actually look, and you would know whether the statement is true or false by looking at the subject that I'm referring to in the statement and knowing that the set that I'm including it in the predicate, right, is correct or not. Which, right? So that's true or false, right? You can tell. Right? Some S is not P, right? That's the particular negative. So that horse isn't a gelding. Right? You could go check, right? Now think about it. Every sentence you can make, you can utter as a statement, right, has to be one of these four types of statements, or it can't be true or false, unless it's more complex. So, for example, I could double them up and I say, that horse is a gelding, that horse isn't. So, but that's obviously a conjunction of two individual smaller statements, one of which is an I statement and the other one is an O statement. Right? See how that works? You could get into complex issues. For example, if we talk about relational predicates, I gave the book to him. I gave this book to him. However you want to. You could start getting into grammatical issues, but I'm sure that the nuns I had in grammar school could have solved it, right? Diagrammed it, showed you how this basically worked, right? It can also be an issue when we talk about things like Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State during the Obama administration. what kind of statement is that? That would be an A statement, because I'm talking about all the members of the set that are Hillary Clinton, is in predicate of Secretary of State in the Obama administration, right? So, you're looking at these forms, these statement forms, but at the same time, you could see how, even though our language can make really complex statements and so on, in order for the statement to be true or false, you're going to have to figure out which particular arrangement or combination of arrangements you've got of these, in a sense, atomic statement types that put it all together, right? And these four statement types also have a logical relationship. If I'm talking about a subject that's the same in all four statements and a predicate that's the same in all four statements, so all blondes have more fun. Right? No blondes have more fun. Some blondes have more fun. Some blondes do not have more fun. I happen to know from inquiries I've made over the years of students that in that case, the A statement is false, the E statement is false, but both the I statement and the O statement are true. So you get the idea. If I have exactly the same subject and predicate on the square, I can look at the logical relationships between the A, E, I, O statements. So for example, these are contraries. In other words, both cannot be true. If one is true, the other one is false. But they both can be false, as in that case, right? Because it's not the case that all blondes have more fun, and it's not the case that no blondes have more fun. Right? Because there are individuals that I realize that when I look down here, it could be the case that both are true. So subcontraries, both can be true. At least one of them is true. Maybe both. In fact, often it seems like we're saying both. Someone says some paperbacks are inexpensive. You could presume that they also would be implying that some paperbacks are not inexpensive. Right? So that is kind of a natural, right? Notice that these are the contradictories. So if it's true that all blondes have more fun, then this person who's blonde and saying she doesn't have more fun contradicts that. Can't be the case if this is true, right? If, on the other hand, we have to tell her, hey, you do. You have more fun, you just don't realize it. And this is true, and this is false, and she was wrong. I'm not suggesting that. And this way as well. Right? You see how those would be contradictory. So when we talk about contradicting someone, make sure you're aware that it's, if this is true, then that is false. You can't have both. Right? Contraries, both could be false. Subcontraries, both could be true. Right? And we also have these alterns, right? So normally, traditionally, if this was true, then this would also be true, because all of these are true, then this one has to be true. If this is true, then this has to be true, right? Just because this is true, by the way, doesn't prove that this is, and also this one, right? So that's your traditional square of opposition. And here's those relationships that I just went over in detail, etc. By the way, the modern revision of the square, we don't really have to get into at this point. This is based on Boole George Boole's revision of it. So we're looking at 18-something. And the reason for it is modern Western European languages seem to have an additional bit of information in particular statements, the I and the O statements, that are not in the universal statements. And that's existence. You're literally implying existence of the subject in modern European particular statements. If it's true, you actually have to have a member existing in that set. Whereas we can talk about universal sets and it's not required. So as a result of that, the argument is, if you accept that critique, that the revised square loses those other relationships and you just have the contradictories. I hate it, by the way. It's so much more boring. Right? So that's all interesting there. Now, let's look at syllogisms. So basically, if I'm going to have an argument, which is the next step up from a single statement, if I only have two statements, I don't have an argument yet. If I say cows are happy, horses are sad, I don't have an argument. I need at least three statements before I have an argument. So for example, all terrorists are evil. Saddam Hussein is a terrorist. Therefore, Saddam Hussein is evil, right? You all saw how that went, and you followed it automatically. Because Aristotle wasn't trying to teach us how to be more logical. He was describing how we are naturally more logical, right? And so you have a syllogism that has three parts: the subject, the predicate of the conclusion, and the middle term. By the way, you hear lots of discussion about the middle in lots of law cases and so on. And what they're talking about is the middle term. Unless you actually complete the process, you're not going to have a deductive argument that way. And there are some very specific argument forms which are valid. 15 to 24, depending on whether you're using the traditional square, in which case there's 24, or the Boolean interpretation, which cuts back a few and you only have 15. But here's a perfect example. In fact, this is called the divine argument, right? Because it's perfect. This is also named Barbara, because those names which you see like Celerent, these are codes, so that you could not only remember the argument forms, but they're also codes that tell you exactly how you can transform each of these arguments into the divine argument, etc. So all men are mortal, all Greeks are men, therefore all Greeks are mortal. That's exactly the same form of argument that I just gave you with Saddam Hussein is evil as a terrorist, right? All terrorists are evil. Saddam Hussein, who's all of the ones that are Saddam Hussein, are a terrorist, is a terrorist. He's dead now, so I should have put it in past tense. Therefore, Saddam Hussein is evil, right? So you can see that it's the same form, argument form, even though I use different terms. Am I boring you to death? I can move on to something else. So these are syllogisms, and by the way, you can have more and more complex arguments by stringing syllogisms together, which is referred to as a Sorites. Sorites, which literally is a heap. And it's famous. There's also a paradox of the heap, where you take one grain of sand. Is that a pile? Answer no. Another grain. Is that a pile? Is that a pile? How many grains of sand does it take before you have a pile? No one knows, as far as I know, right? At some point, though, we say now it's a pile, but we don't have a clear discriminator between, not yet. So that's the paradox of the heap. But if you pile your syllogisms together, by the way, as an experiment, years ago when George W. Bush gave the State of the Union address, which, by the way, when is Trump giving President Trump, when is he giving the next State of the Union? It's usually January, isn't it?
Within the next few weeks.
Yeah, it should be soon. In any case, I did analyze George W. Bush's State of the Union, and it was Barbara, 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 all the way down. Clearly professionally done. Obviously, he has speechwriters team, about 15. He did. They all do, by the way. But in any case, so you daisy link them, if that's an expression, right? That makes sense. You connect them by usually having the conclusion of the one syllogism become one of the premises of the next one. So they just daisy link down and so on. And in that case, by the way, since the deductive argument forms are valid, your argument is sound as long as your premises are true. You have true premises and a valid form, people have to accept your conclusion. So if you were going to argue with George W. In that case, you would have to argue with his premises, whether you accepted his premises as true or not. But if you accept the premises, you've got to accept the conclusion. Just as you saw Saddam Hussein as evil, right? You've connected that yourself. By the way, not everybody can actually do that, and part of the problem is fetal alcohol and other things of that sort, mental damage of one sort or another. You have a logic circuit that enables you to do that. One of the clues I've noticed is people that don't laugh at jokes, don't get jokes, tend to have logic circuits missing. That's one clue. That doesn't mean they're less of a person, although they're certainly not going to be able to do everything, right? Okay, so this is syllogisms.
February 4th, by the way, I'm mistaken.
February 4th? Usually it's January. I wonder why it got postponed. Too much stuff going on, I guess. Has to be within a certain time of the new year, I think. Okay. So, categories. When we talk about the nature of the categories, well, we're talking about causes, and causes is really another word for the categories. What kinds of causes are there? We have, in fact, I'm going to use the board at this point. Is that all right? I know it's primitive, but I don't know if this would get that or not. Maybe I'll just move it over closer. So, when we're thinking about Plato's philosophy, we had two causes. The material cause and the ideas, right? So, two T's in matter or what? So as you recall, Plato's theory of the ideas is that matter is kind of constantly in flux. That's why it's even. Ideas are perfect and unchanging, and they sort of radiate. He uses like the sun as a metaphor for it. It's not really the sun, but the sun is like a metaphor that it shines on the earth, and as a result we can see things because of the light of the ideas, right? Now, Aristotle comes along and accepts that there are ideas and that there is matter, but he argues that ideas don't exist apart from matter, right? That everything has to have substance. And he breaks matter up into four types of things. The ideas are also the shapes of things. So also refer to it as the forms, the shapes things take, right? They also have the matter, but now that moves into the set of causes as one of the causes. And everything changes from one form to another. So I've got my ingredients here. I'm going to make a spanakopita, Greek food. Is that right? I don't know really how to say it. But, you know, you take your dough, your sheets of dough, you know, that and then you separate them with the oil, and you flip them over and put them in the bottom of the pan, and then you put all your ingredients, your spinach and your chicken and your various spices and some rice to absorb some of the fluid, and then you take more of the same sheets and you oil them with olive oil, of course, and you put those on top, and then you throw it into the oven for 345 degrees for 45 minutes. And it comes out, and it's delicious, right? Just so you know. You knew that? Okay. How did that all happen? So there's stuff, the ingredients, right? They're in one shape when I start, but I use my hands and roller pin and all this other stuff, which is the efficient calls it the efficient cause, or the tools, the mechanism by which the change takes place, right? And the whole purpose of this is delicious meal, right? So you've got a purpose over here, not the, sorry, I couldn't spell purpose, but you also call this telos. The telos. Remember, his name is Aristotle, or the best purpose, best arrangement, everything. So we have these four causes of why anything is the way it is. It's made out of stuff, it has a particular shape, it's gotten to that shape because of the events, the tools, the things that have manipulated it, and it is that way because everything in the universe has its place, its purpose. That becomes the great chain of being. Everything is in its place, right? So these are the four causes, and this explains how the process continues, because of course once you have a thing, it's shaped a certain way, etc. You have other things that act on it, right? People will come in and they eat the piece, right? Meanwhile, you might put a little sprig of some kind of garnish on it, right? And then they eat it, right? You know, and then after they go home, then they throw up, right? You know, and no, I'm sorry, that's terrible, right? But you get the idea, you know, there's constant stuff happening, and what's happening, you've got this constant interrelationship between these things, etc. So you have four causes. Notice the ideas are the shape of things now, right? Then, when we talk about the major categories that everything has to fit in, we have is this boring yet, or am I doing okay? Okay, so I talked about the fourfold. Now we've got, I want the 10. Okay, so one of the things that everything must have is substance. But of course you can have different kinds of substance. And so you've got details regarding the substance that everything has. A second thing that everything has is quantity, which by the way is where we get quantum. So when we talk about quantum theory, we're talking about quantity, right? And quantity, how many? Pretty basic, right? Then we have quality. Where's quality? Quantity, okay. So relatives. How are things related to one another? Everything is related to other things. And quality. And quality, of course, has different characteristics as well, whether it's positive or negative, affirmative or negative, right? Whether it's so for example, when we look at the square of opposition, we look at those four statement types. We talk about universal affirmative, universal negative, right? So quantity, universal. Quality, if it's affirmative, that's the affirmative quality. If it's negative, that's the negative quality, right? So so everything is going to have quality and a quantity, right? By the way, they keep talking about Aquinas here. We'll talk about Aquinas when we get to him. And he's an Aristotelian. He's the one that brings Aristotle in and makes him the church dogma, basically. And so, by the way, the church dogma of the Roman Catholic Church today is still Thomism, with Thomas, right? So that's amazing. Think about how long that lasted. Somehow we needed to break those up into 10. They didn't give us that. Had a different. Whoa. This looks like a whole book. Sorry about that. Don't want to do that. But you get the idea. So, categories. Now, how does this actually work out in practice? So as I gave you examples of true or false statements, and I said, all horses are true, right? If I say all horses are true, I don't mean that. I meant all horses are animals. That's true. So here's my horses. So that's a category or a set of things, right? They are all inside a larger category of things called animals. And in fact, I could have even had an in-between set, say, kind of horses are, they graze, they're grazing animals, right? There's a name for that. I can't think of it offhand though. Oh, I'll just say they eat, or they're they graze, grazing animals. Right? So think about my argument, right? If it's a horse, then it's a grazing animal. If it's a grazing animal, then it's an animal. So therefore, if it's a horse, then it's an animal. So you can see that argument, how that argument is just really very basic, right? You could also see that these are where you get true and false sentences, provided we know which category things are. All animals are included in things, etc. Right? So basically, what Aristotle is teaching us is that all of our knowledge is based on true statements, and knowing that other statements that are false are false. If you know that, then you know everything. That's the goal, right? What is knowledge? Knowledge of true and false statements, right? And by the way, how do you get these categories and know that they're true? You go out and you look. You do what we call science today. We go and find animals and we describe them, like his books, right? So you describe the gait of animals, the types, the history of animals, right? You describe fish, the kinds of fish there are, describe the planets, right? And once you basically do this, you have what we would today call an encyclopedia. It's just a description of everything, and you're done. Now, obviously, there's always going to be new things to find. While Alexander was out destroying things, he would send stuff back to his teacher. He had 2,000 men dedicated to constantly running things back to Athens for his teacher. And so you imagine there was kind of like a zoo and stuff at the Lyceum where he's gathering all this stuff and recording it all, right? Writing it all down and describing all the parts, elephants, big, squishes people that try to get in its way, kills people if it sits on you, so don't, Did you ever read The 100-Year-Old Man that stepped out his window and disappeared? An elephant sits on the guy in that book and kills him. It's absolutely hilarious. That shouldn't be, but it was, actually. Okay, so that's how the categories work. Is this fun? Boring? Totally different than Plato, right? This is actually pretty good stuff still today. When we were talking about Plato and the ideas and how we know things, our heads are our eyes are rolling around like, yeah, right, But when you listen to this, you're like, well, duh. That's it, right? That's simple, right? Notice in this, he's talking about, he's describing the various philosophers we talked about as the pre-Socratics. And you can see, as he describes this, notice they're talking about the different types of material causes. The so-called material cause would be the arche, right? what is the arche according to each of these different philosophers as we go. And by the way, for Aristotle, the arche question he solves by arguing that there are 5. The 4 that Empedocles gives us, right, which is earth, air, fire, and water, right? And then the 5th one is ether. And you wonder, well, where does ether show up? Not here. Ether is the quintessence, the 5th essence, which, by the way, they made a movie called The Fifth Element, and it's not the same as what Aristotle said. It's not Leilu, and that's not ether, the 5th element. That could have been funny, but it wasn't because you didn't see the movie. Should I show you Leilu? Anybody want to see Leilu?
See the orange hair girl?
Yes.
Yeah.
My favorite is where she gets a pass that she uses in order to get on. Let's see.
I like Bruce Willis and Christopher and someone. Okay.
Your face. Your face. What? I'm so good. Yeah. Multipass. Little Dallas multipass. Multipass.
Multipass. She knows it's a multipass. Little Dallas, my wife, a newlywed, just met. You know how it is. Bump into each other, sparks happen. Yeah, she knows it's a multipass. Interview.
Just Leilu, multipass. I always joke about the 5th element because obviously there is such a thing in Aristotle's mind, ether. They actually thought ether might still be out there in space up until they did experiments on the speed of light and shot a beam of light to the moon, etc. And they thought it would slow down or something because of the ether in between, and of course it didn't. There isn't ether there. Today they think of it as kind of sort of bubbles, but that's still not ether. So that's kind of interesting, I suppose. So, by the way, even though Aristotle's texts are considered hard to read, there are gems, they say, of text in there that are kind of famous quotes. So that's one of the things. If you get the chance, read more of Aristotle, and you'll be surprised at the wonderful things you find in there. The grammar is really quite impressive. It's a lot of detail, a lot of boring detail today by our standards today, but they were really important details, of course, in education for many, many years. Still are. Okay. So, lots of great stuff in the metaphysics, and we obviously just barely touched on any of that. But even more important today, I suppose, I don't know how, when I think about everybody yelling at one another today and saying, so-and-so is lying, you're lying, and then I listen or I read what they're supposed to have been lying about, I discover that they're usually interpretations of theories which are neither true nor false. And strictly speaking, in order for someone to lie, they have to know that something is false and say that it is true intentionally to screw somebody one way or another, right? Well, the thing is, if that's the case, then in order for you to lie, what statement you're making has to be of the form that will either be true or false. But an awful lot of what people are claiming someone is lying about today are interpretations statements that are neither true nor false, right? For example, if, I think I don't know, did I mention, this is a cup? Everyone agrees this is a cup? Yes? Is this a good cup or a bad cup?
Good cover. Come on.
Actually, it's a terrible cup because it leaks.
Oh.
I didn't get you, did I?
No, you're fine.
But that's just funny. But actually, neither of those last two statements, good or bad, is a true or false statement. Because you can have an opinion about whether it's a good cup or not. I can have an opinion, and you know what? Unless the scientist comes in and says and establishes a standard and says, "No, that's not a good cup." If it's just an opinion, then we don't have true or false statements. We have opinions, and everybody can have an opinion. Everybody's interpretation can be, So when you get into, we don't have global warming. We do have global warming. Neither of those statements, as I understand it, are either true or false. They're interpretations of data. The specific data might be true or false, that you could look at. But when we get right down to it, unless we have a particular establishment of this is what we would mean by global warming, and here's the data that supports it. If it's a theoretical opinion, theory is neither true nor false. So that's kind of, when we, so one aspect of what thinking of how logic works, when you see all this nastiness that we see, especially in politics today, with people saying, he's lying about that, or she's telling the truth about that, as if that's terrible. Shouldn't be telling truths. The thing is, if they're theoretical kinds of statements, what's really happening, of course, is that people are having a difference of opinion. And it's wrong, I think, to say that so-and-so is lying when they're just having a different opinion than you are about something, right? Does that make sense? We're being nasty. And also demonstrating our lack of education and thinking that there's actual lying going on when... one of the people that got me was a doctor, a lawyer, doctor. She literally had a whole book about somebody lying, and as she described the various lies of the individual, it occurred to me that not a single one of those were statements that could have been either true or false. So it was simply something wrong that a PhD ought not to have said in the book, if that makes sense. Howard. Okay. So should we take a break? Do you need a break, or should I move on to the Nicomachean Ethics? Just keep going? Keep going? I didn't ask you any quiz questions so far, so let me ask you one on the logic first. As a quiz question, email me a statement that you know is true. Could be pretty darn easy, right? All horses are animals. But you can send me your favorite true statement. So it can be, that's not too hard, right? Okay. So moving into the ethics portion of it. If I were to talk about normative ethics. Normative ethics would be like giving you the 10 Commandments. So what are the Ten Commandments? They're a set of normative ethics. Thou shalt not do this, do this, do this, do this, right? So I'm talking about morality, but in that context, I'm talking about specific behavior. And so I'm establishing a norm, how people normally should behave morally, right? But when we're talking about comparing different systems of ethics, ethical theories, right? Now we're doing meta-ethics, just like metaphysics, right? But we're doing meta-ethics. So we're talking about various ethical theories. So I use a map, if that makes sense. I call it a cognitive map. Remember, I plagiarized it, so there's other people out there that use cognitive maps. And in my cognitive map, I think about the different directions as the different types of ethical theories. So, for example, deontology, I would put up at the top. So deontology, I put at the top. This is certainty. I'm certain. About what's right and what's wrong. And by the way, the reason I'm certain for it is because God said, thou shalt not murder. Or, if she walks around town without a head cover, you should stone her to death. Or whatever, right? Statements of that sort, beliefs of that sort, are deontological beliefs, right? Usually, of course, come from a priestly source or a text of some sort, and so on, right? Then we have Aristotle's virtue ethics. And virtue ethics are based on myself, my ego, my best interests. But not being mean or anything. It's instead the idea that I'm thinking about how I personally can flourish as a human being, doing excellent things. Excellent in, whether, say, I'm a gymnast and I want to be the best gymnast in the world, a skier, I want to be the best slalom skier, I'm the best philosophy teacher in the world, the best teacher you'll ever have had. Wow, that's something I can shoot for, right? And so we associate that with Aristotle. And over here we have communitary ethics, which is the we, right? A local community we. A community has a particular way of doing things. So when we talk, the anthropologist Mead goes to Samoa, Guam, wherever she went, I forget, and she does her studies and so on. And talks about the way people believe and so on. Or the anthropologist Benedict, I forget her first name. She does the same sort of thing. She visits like the Apache or the Zunis, the different Indians and so on. And she studies their communal ethics and the way they believe right and wrong, why we're here, and so on. So they all have a particular community ethic that everybody should follow if you're from that community. And by the way, if you're not from that community, they don't think you're worth, being even called human, right? A lot of the tribes, they refer to themselves as human beings, and if you're not, well, then you're not a human being, right? You're not one of the members of their tribe. Right? And by the way, a philosopher that fits in here that we haven't discussed yet would be David Hume. And then we have, so certainty, the I, we. My fourth direction is uncertainty. And we also have a philosophical title for this. We can call it pragmatism. Remember, that's kind of us. But we also refer to it as utilitarian. And a iconic philosopher that we associate with this point of view would be John Stuart Mill. So, and up here we have an iconic philosopher that goes with that Kant. So this is the way my map, kind of in my mind, I cognitively arrange this. And the idea is, of course, that I can see kind of opposites. And these are abstract words, it kind of helps to have a map, kind of just physically look at how they might relate. And into this map, each of us are born. And I say in my map, by the way, you can make your own map. This is my map, but you can use it if you like. At birth, we come into the world and we're here because our focus is on ourself, although it's not developed yet. It's not maybe that we don't even have a concept of self yet, but we're happy or unhappy depending on whether we're hungry, we have gas, whatever, right? Babies, right? So we're focused on the self, and to a certain degree, we're in a world where certitudes exist, hopefully. Mom and Dad love us, and when we're hungry, Mom comes and feeds us and changes us when we're uncomfortable, and loves us and hugs us and talks to us, and entertains us and does all that stuff. So normally in a healthy parental environment, I would think that we would kind of move in this direction. This is if you're an American. Right? Hopefully everybody gets that kind of treatment as a baby. I realize that's certainly not the case, as some kids have been flushed down toilets, thrown in dumpsters, left outside under bushes in the cold, even in Eagle River. So that's kind of horrible. In fact, one of my children was put up for adoption because of failure to thrive. So that's kind of sad. I mean, one of the ones we adopted. It wasn't one of mine that we left out some, We have 4 children, but Donna and I could not figure out how to make them. Turns out to be much harder than, even the manual said. So fortunately, we had 8 people out there voluntarily gave us one of their children, which takes 2, so we ended up with 4, not 8. One in California, where I was stationed with the Defense Language Institute, 1 in Berlin, Germany, 1 in Fort Meade, Maryland, and 1 here in Anchorage. In any case, So hopefully, you go in this direction. Now, in the United States, at this point, the educational system should pull you down towards uncertainty. And that's because this is where science tends to sit. Science tends to argue that the good thing about being a scientist is that you're always looking to see how to improve the theories that we already have. What's wrong with the ones we're using, right? So it's constantly looking to improve by changing, etc. So uncertainty, right? We don't know. We're proud to be those that we've got this theory and that's the one that we'll use, that's our warranted assertion, until we find something better. And what we're testing was to see if there's anything wrong with it. Keep hoping, actually, that we find something wrong with it, because that means we'll find an even better explanation later, right? Now, think about your car. When I first started driving a car, it was a metal tank. Everything was manual, all that, stuff. And now I go out and I ask the car permission to get in. It lets me in, and I said, "Could you please take me so-and-so?" And the car says, "We'll think about it." It's a German car, so sometimes in this weather it says, "Es ist zu kalt," Ich will nicht gehen, says some of the car, some of the time. In nice female language, though, it's a feminine, so obviously the technology is changing. I don't think I have a choice, by the way. I can't change it. You ask me, "Can you speak English?" It's like, "Nein." As if, why? Why would I speak English? I'm just totally kidding. It is a German car, but it speaks English. It's an Audi. I have to show you this, though. This is hilarious.